Welcome to Solutions from the Yard, a candid discussion about life behind bars and its effect on society. We'll discuss reintegration or re-entry back into the community post-incarceration. Your host for this episode is Charles Hopkins.
Welcome to this edition of Solution from the Yard. I'm Charles Hopkins.
And my name is Michael Dickinson.
And I'm Dietrich Trent.
Today we'll be talking about the Sentencing Commission and all things relative to the Sentencing Commission. We have a distinguished guest today that will be talking about this. We have Mr. Norman Ramel, currently serves as counsel of Valdak, Raskin, and Clark, PC. Norman has devoted his career to the defense of criminals accused at the trial, appellate, and post-conviction level, and to criminal justice reform advocacy. Most recently, Norman was global CEO of Fair Trials. Norman is renowned for his tenure as executive director of National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, a position he valiantly served for 15 years. He co-founded the John Adams Project with the ACLU to provide attorneys qualified in capital defense to represent individuals at Guantanamo Bay. And he leads a collaboration among several groups to establish Clemency Project 2014, one of the largest national pro bono projects ever undertaken by the legal profession, and which secured the commutations of long federal prison sentence for 894 individuals, including more than 300 who were serving life sentences. Welcome to Solutions from the Yard, Norman.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for the wonderful work you do.
And we're going to start out by acknowledging that when we solicited for Norman to come, we contacted, it's pronounced
SEDIC.
We asked the SEDIC. We contacted the SEDIC Association to help us unpack this information about the sentencing, federal sentencing, and our attempt was just to have Norman just come on via the phone, and we'll talk. But he graciously said that he would come to our little basement operation. So thank you very much. Let's start off by what is the SEDIC organization?
It's a criminal justice reform organization, a not-for-profit whose mission is to promote sentencing reform, fairness in the criminal justice system, and is motivated by the core principle which I think unites all of humanity, which is the concept that all people are capable of redemption, and that we should have much greater fairness and much greater compassion in how we approach criminal sentences.
And what is the U.S. Sentencing Commission?
Well, the United States Sentencing Commission was created roughly 50 years ago. It was the Fair Sentencing Act of 1984. It was the culmination of a very, in my opinion, ill-conceived idea that we needed to have uniformity in sentencing. It wasn't intended to lead to severe uniformity, but that's what resulted as a result of that so-called reform. So the commission is a government entity which is 7 members appointed by the President of the United States, subject to Senate confirmation, 3 of whom must be federal judges, and no 4 of whom can be members of the same political party. And its role is to establish sentencing practices and policy for all federal criminal sentences. So it doesn't affect state courts at all, but it does control how sentencing is handled in the federal courts. And I would just say preliminarily that for the first roughly 25 years of its existence or so, till the early 2000s, they were compulsory guidelines. They are now advisory, but unfortunately, judges, many of whom, unlike me, never practiced before the guidelines, they feel anchored to them. And so the policies and the rules that are promulgated by the commission really do have a tremendous impact on how people gets sentenced, how the sentences are calculated, and it's a rather formulistic approach. It doesn't necessarily take into account so many of the permutations that human beings display. It's critically important that we focus on how the commission does its work. Now, I'll also say that commission goes through an annual review process. That's what the comments that SEDEC and so many other groups put in are to try to influence what the commission looks at and what kinds of reforms they pursue. And it's an annual process, which for several years, going back to I think around 2018, commission didn't have a quorum because the president's nominees had not been confirmed, and they have to have a quorum in order to do business. So this last cycle was sort of like a catch-up year, and now they're asked for, and they're considering, and they've since decided what the priorities are going to be for the next cycle.
Okay, and going back to what you just said, the SEDEC Association submitted a request for comments on proposed priorities for amendments cycle 23 and 24. Before we investigate what is the proposed, explain that process before we unpack some of the things that y'all are interjecting. And
sure,
because both my colleagues, both of them have been subjected to the formality of the sentencing project process, right? And both of them have suffered tremendous incarceration as a result of like the draconian system.
Sure, and that's what we saw when you mentioned the Clemency Project that I was involved in. All of those people had suffered the draconian, horrific, compulsory calculations, and that was part of what we were trying to rectify. But the process is really, I'm going to do this, I'm going to really simplify it, but basically what they do is, first, they ask the public, through a formal process, what do you think we should take up in the coming year? They get that input, they consider the input, then they announce what they're going to look at, then they will take comments from the public on what they should do in the priority areas that they've announced, and eventually they will come up with potential recommendations for that cycle. Those recommendations will take effect in each year unless Congress overturns it. So there's still, even with the ones that they've just proposed, theoretically, Congress could stop it. Hopefully, some of them are quite good that came out of the last cycle, and we'd hate to see that. But that's basically the overall process.
All right, and Mike, explain what happened with you. Explain your sentencing situation and what happened. And here we Norman. Here we have the dichotomy we faced with in DC is that we're under federal jurisdiction, but we're under DC code. All right, so we have federal jurisdiction in DC code, and some federal statutes directly impact
Understood.
DC residents. They'll say, they'll make that known, like if you sentence under U.S. federal code and DC code, this applies. Mike.
Yeah, when I got sentenced before the feds took over in '98. So I was still under what you consider what was the old law. And my problem was that I was sentenced under an act that was formed by DC Council. And when I went to the feds, they didn't really know how to deal with it because, it wasn't federal. It wasn't, none of the uniformity that they had in the feds. So basically I was just sitting dormant, trying to understand something, the law that I was under, what was called the Omnibus Act, because I didn't understand it. That was my third time ever being incarcerated, and I never seen a sentence like that before. So now I'm in the federal system trying to understand a sentencing that I've never seen, and they didn't have no dealings with because they didn't know nothing about it. The feds didn't know nothing about it. So it was a real hassle, and it was a struggle for me because now it's almost like I was being falsely imprisoned because I'm under a sentencing that wasn't federal, and it was something that was enacted in between 94 and 2000 under DC Council. Then after 2000, it was no longer in existence. So, I had to just, really sit down, and it was a struggle for me because I was trying to understand, like, how could somebody even sentence you with something like that? And then the system that I was under didn't even know nothing about it. So that's what I went through.
And did you explain your situation in your sentence? And by the way, Mike, how much time did you serve prior to being released?
I served 24 years.
Excuse me. How you doing?
Great.
Great, man. So my story is I was incarcerated as a juvenile 3 days after I turned 16 years old. So I was charged as an adult. I was Title 16, and under this Title 16, I was brought under. I did 25 years, by the way, and under this Title 16, it was a particular code that they had to bring me under to charge me as an adult. So once they brought me under that, they brought me under another code, which was 22503, which has been revised now, which no longer stands. And it was the statute was so old that it came from during colonial. It was over 100 years old. Actually, the statute came out in 1903. They was using it in 1993, and it was dealing with it didn't have any particular charge. It said if you attempt to commit any of these other offenses. So that was broad. And the thing about it was that under that statute, it allows them to give me a life sentence as well, because the statute only encouraged 5 years on paper, but it was fine print. I was blind to the law. I didn't know. And I argued this in the courtroom, and they said I was right, that I was over sentenced. Under this statute, it allowed them to give me more time than 5 years because I commit this offense. And I'm like, I don't understand. This don't make sense. So I asked the judge about this statute. I said, hey, why is the law book stating that 22503 only encouraged 5 years? He said, yeah, well, you technically right. It only encouraged 5 years, but you caught that offense while armed. I said, hold up, that's 223202. You gave me that. Why is I being enhanced twice under one thing? So I was told it was a time I was right, but this wasn't the right vehicle to challenge my sentence. And this was this statute was so ambiguous that they had to revitalize it and take it out. It don't even exist no more. It no longer exists. Mm-hmm. And the thing about it, I was so curious because a lot of brothers that came in with me that was juveniles and they had similar charges. And I just say, what statute you got brought under? Man, not mine.
Right.
We all got the same time. Like, what is going on? So yeah, that was my situation. I ended up doing 25 years on it, and I'm thankful I'm home now. But
we see that when it comes to sentencing, it's no uniformity.
No.
Right. And this is what as you said earlier, that the purpose of the sentencing commission is they say what they're going to deal with, and then they ask for comment on it. And even by your own observation, saying like because of the lack of uniformity, it's important that we come to some kind of consensus on how to develop a uniformity.
Well, I think there should be uniformity in terms of applying the law correctly and making sure that individuals are not over-sentenced, either intentionally or unintentionally. But the problem with uniformity is that it doesn't take into account how different people come to their circumstances for different reasons. It doesn't take into account all of the potential mitigation that may apply. So while I understand the idea, they were trying to deal with the fact that there was a perception that some judges were very hard sentencers, some were very light, and they thought there was something unfair about that. In my view, and I say this as somebody who practiced criminal defense for 25 years before I got into reform work per se, I would rather take my chances with a system where judges they're not bound by fixed rules and regulations, and they can look at the individual circumstances. And I think that's a much more humane system. That doesn't mean you're not going to have some outliers, but one of the results of this move for uniformity, which also led to in many cases, because of federal funding for prison construction, we did away with the parole in a lot of states as well. And the problem is that's why we have mass incarceration. We've got to figure out a way to change that, and I think some of the steps that the commission is now taking are moving in that direction, and I think hopefully they're going to do more in the coming years. This seems to be a pretty good group of commissioners, and they certainly are reaching out to the public to get input in a broad way.
How do they come up? How do they come up with the? Because you said earlier that they come up with issues that they want to look at relative to sentencing, and then they open it up for public comment. But how do they come up with that aspect of, like, how do they come up with, like, okay, we're gonna look at the men raised of a sentence, we're gonna look at the mitigators of a sentence, we're gonna look at the social conditions of a sentence, those contributing. How do they come up with something that we can weigh?
That's a great question.
Can weigh in on?
That's a really great question, and to some extent, I can take it. I can make an attempt at answering it, but some of it I can't answer. Okay, there are 7 commissioners, and they take all this input. They deliberate amongst themselves. Now, one thing that they also do, which can be very helpful, is they collect data and they analyze data. They have a big staff to do that. And so that is now helping to inform the kind of issues that they're going to take up. So actually, if I can jump ahead. Go ahead. So among the priorities that they've announced there for this coming cycle, they listed 10 things. I want to focus on 3 of them. One of them is that they want to examine the extent to which diversion programs, alternative incarceration programs, and even reentry programs are effective, and have seminars and put together a website and eventually establish best practices. Now, that really dovetails with one of the recommendations that SEDEC made, but they certainly weren't the only group that have been calling for this. This shows me that the commission is finally, because there's nothing in the guidelines about alternatives to incarceration or diversion programs. This shows me that they are finally recognizing that there are lots of different ways that you can help the people who find themselves in trouble, who oftentimes it's because of an underlying pathology. It's a mental health issue. It's a substance abuse issue. It's family abuse. It could be any one of a number of things. Get to the underlying problem and find a way to approach it without putting people in prison, which destroys their lives, often destroys the family's life, and is frankly costing the taxpayers a lot of money, which it shouldn't, which could be better used in these alternatives. So that's one thing that I'm really excited that they're taking on.
Okay, go ahead.
And there are a couple more, but I'll pause there.
Anybody want to weigh in on that? Because here we recognize now, based on what you just said, that if they take this up, and this is something to look at, then that open the door for services, organizations that's in society, organizations in the community that's in the reentry field, to become involved in having network with them and create some kind of network with them to say, well, we provide this type of service or these type of things men and women need when they come out. Dietrich?
No, so I want to come back to the alternative incarcerations. What particular group of charges would benefit from this? Because I know this is broad brush on all citizens.
So this is sort of right now, I would call it a kind of a grassroots type of thing, where individual districts, the federal system is broken up into districts. Most states have multiple districts. Some states have only, depending on their population.
Right.
But each district has its own approaches, and it's sort of we don't really even know all the programs that are out there. You've got some judges who have just stepped up to the plate and said, I want to try this. It's modeled after in some cases, drug courts, some cases, community courts. And so the thing that the commission is now committing to doing is sort of looking at all of them, finding out how they operate, sharing that information across jurisdictions. And I believe ultimately when they look at these and they see the positive impact, lower recidivism, less incarceration, dollar savings, and human benefits, I think they may begin to recognize it and begin then to be more intentional about creating guidelines and commentary that will advise courts of when and how to use these. So I just think it's a great step forward.
Yeah, well, we always talk about that, based on some of our conversations about, what the police here for. And basically that's kind of like you kind of touched on that. It's more so being more community based. And that's the approach that sometimes we always had those type of discussions. Police are not in the communities no more just to protect and serve. Far as like, you knew your neighborhood police, the police that used to come around your neighborhood. They knew everybody in the neighborhood. You knew them. It's not like that no more. Now you see police, the first thing you do, you film. Even if you're not a criminal, you still like you apprehensive once you see the police.
We're getting a little off the guidelines, but I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the benefits of having been around and in the criminal justice field for a number of decades is I've seen some of this evolution firsthand. First of all, I think absolutely we do need to have a different approach to policing, which is much more a community, not only community oriented, but community influenced. And one of the things that I have found that it's very troubling to me, obviously, I don't need to tell this audience about disparate policing on certain communities and the perpetuation of racial and ethnic biases. But another dimension of how policing has changed is the idea of actually going into communities, using informants, using undercovers to sort of see, to try to get people to commit crimes, right? Mm-hmm. To instead of, if you arrest somebody for a drug crime, and instead of trying to help them figure out why they're doing it, how you can, then you turn them back into the neighborhood and see if they can get other people to commit. That's not a rational approach to policing. That's a rational approach to pumping up your statistics on how many people you arrest.
Exactly.
And on this, we're getting back on the sentencing, because your first point that you highlighting, right? I think that in advocacy, from an advocacy perspective, that's where I'm in my space. And from an advocacy perspective, we know that this information is being communicated to the courts. Mm-hmm. So we know in the advocacy capacity, and like you say, jurisdiction. So in the District of Columbia, it would behoove us to say to the courts that here go an alternative that you might want to take into account. Here go a program in this city that you might want to look at. Here go some agencies that's involved in some things that want to come and talk to you about some of the things that you're doing. Therefore, when you take and consider an alternative, here go alternative, and it behooves us to be in those spaces in terms of tracking the docket entries to identify individuals that might have like the necessary conditions for us to say advocate on their behalf. Say like, oh yeah, we already recognize that y'all got this information about of a person that could benefit from XYZ. What's your second point?
That's exactly what we hope will happen by them actually looking at these and sharing it with the public and putting it on websites and having seminars. It has the potential to really grow.
Mm-hmm. And so you say you want to highlight 3 points.
Yeah, well,
What's your second point?
The other thing that they're finally going to take up is the issue of acquitted conduct. Now, that's a code phrase for the fact that under the federal sentencing guidelines, a judge can take into consideration, in fact, while their advisory now was required to take into consideration conduct for which a person was acquitted. So if they had 5 counts and they got acquitted of 4, but they got convicted of 1, the judge could still take that conduct into consideration to increase the penalty. And that has been a sore spot for the people who've been victimized by it. Okay, and as I see a hand is up, and I'll invite you to talk about it. But let me, because I'm anxious to hear what your experience with it was. But the problem with that, number one, is you're supposed to only be convicted of those things which can be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But the judge, in looking at acquitted conduct, is using a lower standard, preponderance of the evidence. The other problem with it is that it incentivizes prosecutors to bring charges even though they may not have the evidence to get the conviction at trial, but they can use that to increase the sentence that the person is exposed to. So after many years, and there have been some cases now where this has been challenged, and the commission has now committed that in this cycle, they're going to look at potentially reforming this ability to use acquitted conduct, which is long overdue, and I hope they actually get it done.
And as we get ready to close out, do you go ahead and give your experience on,
I have
on this?
two. First one, I need you to answer one question. Then I'm gonna tell you about how that affected me with the law, the acquitted conduct. If Congress blocked the proposal that the Sentencing Commission put up, do the POTUS have the right to overrule the Congress?
No. If Congress blocks it, then you're back to the drawing board, and you got to figure out a way to get something through that Congress will approve. Now, I'm not a historian on this, so I don't know when or if it's happened, but they do have the power. I mean, it's one of these things where it takes effect unless they act. Sometimes having a Congress that can't get its act together can actually be a good thing.
So, thank you for clearing that up. So, the acquittal conduct. So, I was charged with 5 accounts. I got acquitted on 4.
There you go.
I got found guilty on 1. And during the reading of the verdict, the judge stopped them and told them, I need y'all to consider the lesser offense. Mm-hmm. Right? But I was just acquitted of the higher offense. Mm. Why you got to consider the lesser offense? And that was one of the arguments. And by them going back, and this explained to the 22-503, it was all a puzzle. They needed to find me guilty of more than one offense to put the enhancements under the 22-503.
Yeah, right.
So that's why he made them go back and use the lesser offense.
Come back with
so he could boost my sentences up more, because I'd have left out of there with probably 15 years or at the most.
Right.
But that wasn't the case. He made them go back in there and did exactly the acquittal conduct. When I was acquitted, they said, you found him not guilty, but only on one person.
Right.
And he said, no, go back. He read them the jury instructions on these particular charges, and he made them go back, and they came back with a whole different verdict again and found me guilty of the less included offenses as well.
So now imagine that it's just the judge acting on her own or his own.
That's what it was.
And not even using this. I mean, the jury theoretically had to at least find that beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't have to find acquitted conduct beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the problem.
Okay, there you have it. Solutions from the Yard. Thank you.
You've been listening to Solutions from the Yard. This podcast is presented by Voices for a Second Chance, a comprehensive reentry program that provides culturally appropriate, trauma-informed, gender-specific, and peer-based services. For more information, go to info@vscdc.org or visit our website at www.vscdc.org.